Hey, it's Sean. I'm an About You producer, and this is a Donabe. You may have seen the About You series where Andrew takes one ingredient and uses a huge amount of it to make a bunch of different recipes. In one episode where he tackled 20 pounds of cabbage, him and Inka made a napa cabbage millefeuille.
It's a flower hot pot.
You may have noticed the particular pot they used. This was that pot. A couple of weeks ago, I was filming at Andrew's and he offered me this donabe to borrow and try out for a bit.
Okay, good luck.
So donabe is a Japanese word. It breaks down to do and nabe. Do refers to the earth, so clay, and nabe it just means pot. A rough translation would be earthenware. It is an essential part of a kitchen in that you can use it for a bunch of different things. So a lot of my kitchen is made out of very modern, contemporary sort of conveniences. Clay pots really fascinate me because they are one of the oldest cooking technologies in human history. I'm also interested in just getting back to basics and learning how to use one of the building blocks of how we cook today. So for the last few days, I've been donabe cooking as a way to figure out whether I need a donabe for my kitchen. To start testing, I figured I would go back to the most basic and just cook a pot of white rice. It's low-key embarrassing, but I've actually never cooked rice without a rice cooker. And so this was maybe my first time cooking rice on a stove, actually. I was looking for the rice to be really fluffy, to be cooked through but not slimy, and also I was looking for individual grains without it being dry. And also because I was cooking it on a stove, when you cook with a rice cooker, there are sensors that let the machine know to stop cooking. When you're cooking on a stove, obviously there is not that failsafe. So what you end up with if you do it for a little bit too long is what's called the okoge. At the bottom of the pot, there will be a layer of rice that gets a little bit burnt, and in becoming a little bit burnt, it gets really crispy and like savory and nutty. And it's one of my favorite things and something I haven't had since I was a kid. There's something almost poetic about cooking rice in a clay pot. You're rarely gonna cook rice in a single serving, so there's something inherently communal about cooking rice, even if you do end up just eating it by yourself, as I did. And rice is such a staple of the human diet in the way that clay pots are such a building block of human cooking. So the idea of cooking rice in a clay pot, I don't know, there's just something really nice about it that I really enjoyed. I definitely had some of the ratios off. So I wasn't sure if I cooked it for too long or not long enough, but the texture was chewy, but it still had like the right amount of give. It wasn't like hard. And the flavor was like, it brought out this like sweetness to it that I don't think I've ever had when I made rice at home. So white rice test was 100% a pass, off to a great start. Next, I wanted to make my first actual recipe. To prep for that, I wanted to go out and get a little bit of inspiration. So here in Los Angeles, there's actually a store that is fully dedicated to donabe. It's called Toiro. It is owned by Naoko Takei, who is often credited as one of the key evangelists in spreading donabe cooking outside of Japan. She even goes by Miss Donabe, you can look her up. Walking around the store and looking at all the different donabe, it really made me aware of how the shape of something impacts what it does, which I'd have no way of saying that in a way that makes it sound smart. There were some donabe that were specifically for steaming. There were some that were for grilling. There was one that was specifically for making rice. There were some that were for like making eggs, just like single serving type things. And they were all within the donabe family. It's like such a cool store. I had such a good time looking through it. Toiro didn't even sponsor this video. I just learned so much spending time there. I left with a lot of stuff. I was reflecting on the donabe that I'm using. It's really large. This is, I think, like a mass-produced model, if you will. And so as I was leaving, I was thinking, you know, if I really want to give it a shot, I should really try a donabe that is a little bit more suited to somebody who's cooking for themselves, maybe one that's a little bit more special. And so I bought another one. Naoko-san recommended this. It's really small. You can do like stuff for one person in it as opposed to like this large one. If you'll notice, this one is just, it's pretty large, it's huge. Whereas this one you can just do for one person or like one or two people. Naoko-san said that this is one that she used quite often. And in recommending this, she also recommended what I should do for my first actual recipe. So Naoko-san recommended that I try making Yosenabe, which is basically like an anything goes stew. It's sometimes translated as hot pot. She especially recommended that I try making chicken tsukune Yosenabe. Chicken tsukune is like Japanese style chicken meatballs. I usually eat them grilled. I never had them in a nabemono, like a stew. So I wanted to give that a shot. One thing Andrew and I talked about as I was picking up the donabe from him was how using something like a donabe opens up this whole other hallway of cooking. And one thing that I really like about Yosenabe is that it's a very communal experience. Oftentimes it'll be on the table, you'll use a camping stove like this one, and there'll just be a plate of food that everybody is cooking. together. It's something that a lot of my friends do. It's something that I know my family in Japan does. It's a type of cooking that I don't think is celebrated enough because it feels so everyday to so many people. And even though I was using a recipe for this, I referenced Naoko-san's recipe on her Miss Donabe website for the broth and for the different things that I should be cooking. But it's really just a very simple concept that you can riff on however you want. You can make it vegetarian, you can really easily make this vegan. I use a fish broth, you could use a kombu broth, which is like a seaweed broth. I think it's just like a very different way of thinking about stew than we often do within an American cuisine context. The biggest concern that I had, I'd read that if you overheat the clay pots, it will crack. So I was watching out for that. But at the end of it, it was just so easy. It tasted so good, 10 out of 10. It isn't so much, the cooking vessel itself. I think the shape is really conducive to cooking liquids in, and it fits the ingredients really nicely, and there's a lip in it that kind of keeps everything in place. Like it sort of curves up. But I think also just the idea of cooking in this really beautiful vessel that is sturdy enough that you could use every day. It's not just like a special occasion pot. I think there's something really nice about that. So for the third thing I want to make, and this was sort of the big boss, I decided to make Buta Kakuni, which is like a braised pork belly. It's this really rich dish that I will always order if it's on the menu. You basically just like slow cook pork belly until all the gelatin is melted and it becomes like tender and melty, and you braise it in this sweet, savory sauce. Is really, really good. So I know how I like my Buta Kakuni. I wanted to get the thoughts of some other folks, so I called Rie.
Hi.
Hi.
And Rie and I talked a little bit about donabe cooking. She talked about how for her and her family, they typically only use donabe during the winter. But for Buta Kakuni, she was first of all very surprised that I wanted to do it. But I asked her what for her makes a good Buta Kakuni, and she shared some of her thoughts.
It doesn't have bone, but like fell off the bone feeling.
Yeah.
If it doesn't have bone, what do you describe?
You can say like fork tender.
Pork tender,
Yeah.
chopsticks tender. Good luck.
I actually had to drop something off at Rie's place, and when I stopped by, she mentioned that she had a donabe that was a different shape, and so she showed it to me, asked me if I want to borrow it, and so I, of course, said yes. So I started with one and I ended up with three. But this was a really different one. It's a tagine style. A tagine, you may know, it's like a North African style cookware that's used to make a lot of very delicious things. But this one is set up where it is similar to these other ones in that it has this really, it has like a, oh my God. It has like a deepish base so that you can cook things within it. But it also has a steamer plate so you can steam things on it. And then it has this top that just like allows the steam to circulate really beautifully. I wanted to give it a go, so for lunch, as I was prepping for the kakuni, I took some of the leftover chicken tsukune meat and then wrapped it in some of the leftover napa cabbage and then just steamed it, and honestly, it was the best lunch I could have asked for that day. So, kakuni. Naoko-san laughed when I told her I was going to make it, so I came into it a little bit nervous, but I gathered my ingredients. I just bought the largest green onion. I stopped by a butcher in Koreatown who had this really beautiful pork belly. So I got my recipe from Namiko Chen at Just One Cookbook. So the way that the recipe goes, you sear the pork belly and then you go into a step where you simmer the pork belly in water and aromatics over the course of 2 to 3 hours to slowly melt all that gelatin to get it really tender. And then after that, you move it into the flavored braising liquid where you finish it off in this like incredible sauce. Going through this, I will say, was a little bit chaotic. It was a really stressful process. Like, I'll say searing it, I was never quite sure if it was brown enough and there was just oil splattering everywhere. And then when I moved on to the simmering phase, it wasn't getting tender. Like, it stayed tough for a lot longer than I expected it to. Like hour 1, it still felt really tough. Hour 2, it was a little better, but it still felt like there wasn't a lot of give. But even with all of that, there must have just been a massive margin of error. Once I got to like 2.5 hours, something magical happened and the meat just got really, really tender. Normally what you're supposed to do is take it from the pot that you simmered in and move it to another pot. I just used the donabe, made this parchment, otoshibuta, it's called a drop lid, to make sure that it was staying submerged. Throughout all of this wild process, it just came together so beautifully. The meat was so tender. It was, as Rie said, chopstick tender. It like was falling apart. I thought that I was gonna have leftovers and I ended up eating it all because it was just so good. I had to like grab some to give to Rie because she'd asked for it so that I wouldn't eat it all. So that brings me to my final question. Do I need a donabe for my kitchen? There's something about cooking with donabe that activates your senses. In terms of ease, there was a lot of prep involved, I will say. You did have to season this. That is a step that I had to take where you basically make a thick porridge and then you use that to sort of fill in and season the inside of this one. But overall, it was very easy. I'm an amateur cook. I made timing and measurement errors throughout the process, but the donabe is constructed to retain heat in such a way that you get this really gentle, generous cooking process. I do think I picked some recipes that may have been a little bit more foolproof, but everything turned out much better than I expected going into this. I have to say the winner for the week was definitely that first really simple pot of white rice. There's always gonna be an ease in using a rice cooker, I can't deny that. But I would highly recommend, if you are so interested, try using a donabe. It really changed it for me. So in terms of whether I would use it, whether I need one for my kitchen, 100%. I mean, I already bought this one, so it is part of my kitchen. Check out the Donabe Toiro ships, check them out. And all in all, highly recommend the experience. And if you get a donabe and you try making stuff with it, please tag About to Eat, please tag me, I'd love to see it. And thank you for watching.